What would you do if one signature could cost your country 73% of its gold, 41% of its water systems, and hand control of your roads to foreign banks? In the year 2025, that signature sat on the desk of Captain Traoré. But before the pen touched paper, he turned to page 89. And what he read changed everything. This isn't just a story about loans. It's about a quiet war fought with contracts, not guns. So, what was hidden in the fine print? And why did one man say no when the world expected yes? Stay with us. Tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe if this matters to you. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and cold diplomacy. Deputy Envoy Harun, representing the International Monetary Fund, a tall man in a custom suit, watched with practiced patience as Captain Ibrahim Traoré turned page after page of the $200 billion contract laid out before him. No one expected the president of Burkina Faso to read every clause. Most heads of state simply didn't. That was the trick. Distract them with hopeful promises at the start and bury the real terms deep inside the legal jungle where few dared to wander. But Traoré wasn't like the others. He flipped to page 89. There it was, hidden in legal jargon, nestled between innocuous phrases like resource stabilization clauses and economic flexibility provisions, was the actual trap. In the event of fiscal non-compliance, the creditor shall retain immediate access to natural assets, including, but not limited to, mineral reserves, infrastructure zones, and critical extraction routes. He read it once more, then again, and again. His left hand gripped the paper tightly. His right hand, clenched on the desk, began to tremble, not from fear, but from fury restrained. Deputy Envoy Harun leaned in, feigning concern. "Everything all right?" he asked softly. Captain Traoré looked up slowly. "You've been trying to buy my country with a contract dressed as a gift," he replied evenly. "I beg your pardon?" "You've hidden the chains beneath a mountain of promises," he said. "But page 89, he tapped the paper, shows the truth of your intentions. You're not offering aid, you're setting a trap." The room fell silent. "I don't think you understand," Harun began. "I understand perfectly," Traoré interrupted. "You want the gold beneath our soil, the lithium we just discovered. You want the keys to the next century's economy, all dressed in the language of rescue." The envoy stood. "Captain Traoré, this is clearly a misunderstanding. These are standard terms used in dozens of agreements with other developing nations." "And how many of those nations are now bankrupt?" Traoré pressed. "How many had their ports seized, their schools sold off, their sovereignty stripped away, in the name of standard terms?" His eyes didn't blink. "Burkina Faso will not be next." He closed the folder gently, almost ceremoniously, then stood tall, the red of his beret catching the faint light. "Tell your board," he said quietly, "Burkina Faso is not for sale." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind $200 billion on the table. And taking with him something far more valuable, his country's dignity. Outside, the press was waiting. Cameras already positioned for the triumphant handshake they had been promised. But instead, they captured a very different scene. Traoré walking past them without a word. His face unreadable, his resolve unmistakable. Inside, Deputy Envoy Harun sat motionless. One of his aides, Karoma, leaned in. "Do we proceed with the alternate plan?" "No," the man said, eyes narrowing. "He's not like the others. We'll need a different approach." Hours later, in the presidential compound, Traoré gathered his ministers. "They buried it on page 89, he said to them. "If I hadn't read it myself," he added, turning to Minister Aminata, the Minister of Education, who slammed her hand on the table. "They think we're fools." "They think we're desperate," added Minister Kamal, responsible for finance. "And they're not entirely wrong," someone muttered. "We are struggling. We do need roads, water systems, power grids, but we don't need chains." "We build with our hands," Traoré said, "not on our knees." The room was quiet. Then slowly, one by one, ministers nodded. No applause, no declarations, just a shared understanding. A line had been drawn, and they would stand on the right side of it. That night, Traoré sat alone in his office. He pulled the contract from his case again and stared at it beneath the dim desk lamp. His eyes settled one last time on page 89. He took a pen not to sign, but to scribble one bold sentence across it in black ink. A nation's minerals are not collateral, they are inheritance. He folded the page once, then locked it in a drawer. Not for safekeeping, but as evidence of the battle they had just begun. Because this was not the end. This was only the first page of a new story. One written not by the IMF, but by the people of Burkina Faso. And the world had better be ready. The room had barely cooled from the first confrontation when the IMF delegation returned, this time with an adjusted tone. The suit was the same, the smile practiced. But the words, the words were sugar-coated now. No longer were they pitching a deal. They were painting a vision. "We're not here to control," said Chief Negotiator Fan, another senior figure from the IMF, gesturing to a sleek digital presentation projected behind him. "We're here to uplift." "Imagine this, Captain Traoré," he continued. "A national grid powered by solar farms stretching from Kaya to Benora. Smart highways built with climate-resilient materials. Hospitals in every province. Clean water from automated treatment plants." He paused, letting the dream settle in the air. "Burkina Faso could be the showcase of the Sahel," said the IMF negotiator, voice smooth. "A shining example of modern African potential. And it all begins the moment we finalize the loan." Trio said nothing. He sat with fingers clasped together, elbows resting on the polished mahogany desk. His eyes didn't blink, but his silence, heavy and deliberate, filled the space like thunderclouds before a brewing storm. The IMF negotiator pressed on. "There's more," he said. "We're talking satellite internet coverage across rural zones, military-grade security systems for your borders, advanced crop monitoring, and drones to double your agricultural output." He smiled again, this time wider. "And your people, Mr. President, they'd worship the one who delivered it all." Traoré finally spoke. His voice was calm but sharp as glass. "And what does it actually cost?" "As we explained," the man said smoothly, "it's structured over 40 years, a generous grace period, preferential interest. You wouldn't feel the weight until your economy has grown strong enough to carry it comfortably." Traoré leaned forward now, voice dropping low. "I didn't ask about grace periods. I asked what it costs." The negotiator's smile faltered. "Well, as with any sovereign loan, standard covenant supply applies. Economic restructuring, fiscal alignment with global benchmarks, privatization where inefficient public holdings are shown to limit growth. And in case of disruption, page 89, Traoré said flatly. The man hesitated. "Captain, I assure you—" "Let's be clear," Traoré interrupted, his voice rising just enough to hush the entire room. "You're offering us hospitals, but only if we hand over the keys to our future. You offer roads, but we lose the land beneath them if we stumble. You call it a partnership, but I've read the fine print." He leaned closer. "This isn't a loan, it's a leash." The room tensed. The translator paused mid-sentence, unsure whether to continue. But Traoré didn't need translation. His message was already too clear. The IMF delegate shifted tactics. "Captain, I understand your suspicion. But look at the world. Senegal has just signed a similar agreement. Côte d'Ivoire as well." Traoré's eyes narrowed. "And how many of them still own their railways, their ports, their power stations?" Silence. Traoré leaned back now. His tone was calmer, but his words no less fierce. "I've walked through villages where children drink from holes in the ground. I've seen mothers carry sick babies for 10 kilometers to clinics with no medicine." He paused for breath. "You think I don't want change? That I don't dream of clean water, strong roads, connected schools?" He looked each delegate in the eye. "But I won't buy that dream with our grandchildren's future." The IMF negotiator sat down slowly, blinking for the first time in minutes. Traoré stood, straightening his shoulders. "Every promise you've made," he said, "starts with the same phrase. Once we finalize the loan." He walked toward the window, gazing out over the city below. "So let me ask you something," he continued. He turned, face unreadable. "Who owns the roads when we can't pay?" The question hung in the air like a courtroom verdict. Who owns the crops when the rains fail? Who controls the satellite network when we default on grace periods you've designed to expire before our industries even mature? No one answered. "Exactly." Traoré moved toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he paused. "Don't mistake our humility for ignorance. We know what happens when we sign without looking. We've lived it for decades." He glanced back, his voice quiet but sure. "And I've read every word." Then he left them. The IMF team remained seated. The presentation still flickered behind them. Images of schools, drones, and gleaming bridges. But now they were fading. Promises made but not believed. Because for once, someone had asked the one question they never wanted to answer. And that was the beginning of the end for the illusion. The palace was quiet, the kind of silence that settles only after midnight, when even the guards trade sharp discipline for tired nods and quiet footsteps. In a small study tucked behind the presidential library, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone beneath the soft glow of a desk lamp. One hand gripped a red pen. The other turned the pages of the IMF contract, one by one. He'd been a soldier longer than he'd been a president. That meant he understood pressure, ambush, strategy, and the importance of reading what others only skimmed. This wasn't just a loan. This was a weapon, hidden and dressed as paperwork. Page 1 was harmless enough. Standard greetings, diplomatic language, praise for progress, promises of collaboration, commitment to shared prosperity. He marked none of it. Page 14 caught his attention. Fiscal targets may be adjusted in consultation with external review boards. He circled it. Page 33. In the event of revenue instability, loan adjustments may be made through commodity collateral. Underlined. By the time he reached page 50, his eyes burned, but his hand didn't shake. On page 72, he paused. Municipal water services shall be reviewed for possible privatization in accordance with global efficiency benchmarks. He read it again, then once more. He marked it 3 times. He thought of a village in Gorma, where he'd once helped dig a well after rebels bombed the only pump. He remembered the old woman who cried when clean water returned, not because it was rare, but because she believed it was finally hers again. Now they wanted to sell that water back to her. Page 81. Educational sector reform will be guided by international development partners, with priority given to private institutions demonstrating scalable outcomes. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Scalable outcomes," he whispered. They wanted to turn schools into businesses, knowledge into profit, children into mere data points. His jaw tightened. Then came page 89. The page wasn't long, just a few paragraphs, but it was the one they'd built the entire scheme around. A ticking clock, hidden beneath legal prose. In the event of debt distress or failure to meet scheduled repayments, the creditor shall retain immediate access and administrative rights to national assets identified in Annex 4, including but not limited to mineral reserves, energy infrastructure, transportation corridors, and telecommunications networks. He didn't move for a full minute. Then he opened Annex 4. It listed nearly everything: the Tamba manganese mine, the Essakani gold site, the Dori lithium field, the fiber optic cable buried last year, Highway Route 6, the National Telecom Hub. All of it, in exchange for signatures and silence. He put the pen down and rubbed his temples. This wasn't about money, this was extraction. Slow, quiet, and permanent. No guns, no invasions, just contracts. Contracts crafted by people who assumed no one in Burkina Faso would read them. But he did, and he would remember every single word. Traoré stood and walked to the window. He looked out over Ouagadougou. The city lights flickered. Somewhere, a generator buzzed. Somewhere else, a child studied under candlelight. Somewhere farther still, a farmer counted coins to buy fertilizer, all of them, waiting for a better future. This loan promised that future. But it didn't offer ownership, it demanded obedience. He walked back to the desk and opened his notebook, a fresh page. At the top, he wrote one sentence: "Dignity is not negotiable." Then he wrote 3 questions beneath it. Who wrote this deal? Who signed it before us? And who benefits if we fail? He underlined the 3rd question twice. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. If this was the standard contract, how many other African nations had signed similar terms? How many schools had been lost on page 89? How many hospitals mortgaged on page 72? He tapped the folder once, hard. Then he picked up the phone and called his chief legal advisor. "Tomorrow," he said, "gather every minister and bring the contract." "What should I prepare?" the advisor asked. "Just a chair," he replied, "and silence. I'll read it to them myself." As he hung up, he turned back to the final page of the contract. At the bottom, a blank line waited for his signature. He stared at it, then drew a thick red X straight through it. The war wasn't on the battlefield this time. It was here, in ink and paper, and he was ready to fight. The room was already full before Traoré entered. The IMF team had arrived early, confident that the tension from the previous day had passed. The lead representative sat at the head of the long table, adjusting his tie, casually briefing his aides. At the far end, government ministers whispered among themselves, uncertain of what Traoré's next move might be. The contract lay closed in the center, waiting for its final chapter to be written. At exactly 9:01, Traoré stepped in. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't sit. He walked straight to the table, placed one hand firmly on the contract, and with the other, flipped it open. "Let's talk about page 89, he said. The room stilled. Aides froze mid-note. The IMF representative blinked, caught between confusion and discomfort. "Page 89, he repeated. Traoré didn't smile. "Yes, the one you were hoping I wouldn't read." The rep chuckled awkwardly. "Captain Traoré, with all due respect, that's just standard language. All sovereign financing contracts include clauses like that." "Standard for whom?" Traoré snapped back. The rep paused. "It ensures accountability. It ensures ownership." "Yours," Traoré cut him off, "not ours." One of the IMF aides tried to interject. "President Traoré, page 89 is only enforceable under extreme circumstances." "Extreme?" Traoré raised an eyebrow. "Like a drought, a pandemic, a sudden drop in commodity prices?" "Then let me ask you something. Those watching, if you feel this truth, comment Amen below and share how you feel about this injustice. Tell me," he continued, "which African nation hasn't faced those extremes in the last 5 years?" No one answered. He turned to his own ministers. "And what," he asked, "does page 89 say will happen under such extreme circumstances?" They hesitated. Most hadn't read it, so he read it aloud. "In the event of debt distress or failure to meet scheduled repayments, the creditor shall retain immediate access and administrative rights to national assets." He paused, letting it sink in, then continued, slowly, deliberately. "Including, but not limited to, mineral reserves, energy infrastructure, transportation corridors, and telecommunications networks." He closed the folder. "That," he said, "is not assistance. That is acquisition. Quiet, legal, but no less brutal than the chains our ancestors once wore." The IMF representative cleared his throat. "These are hypothetical provisions. Safety mechanisms." "Safety?" Traoré asked. "For whom?" "Mr. President, let's be reasonable. These contracts have been reviewed by dozens of legal experts across multiple nations." "Experts paid by who?" Traoré's voice dropped. "How many of them sit in offices built by foreign banks? How many are insulated from the consequences of the decisions they recommend?" He pointed toward the window. "Because out there, my people won't see clauses. They'll see consequences." The room was tense now. Even his own ministers leaned in, shaken by his clarity. The IMF team glanced at each other, searching for something. Control, leverage, an exit. Traoré didn't give it to them. "Let's be honest," he said, pacing slowly now. "You expected me to skim the summary, to hand this off to advisors, to sign the dotted line, shake hands for the cameras, and call it a day." He turned back. "But I read every word," he said, voice steady. Because every word costs something, and I wanted to know exactly what you were charging. The IMF negotiator tried once more. Mr. President, Burkina Faso could benefit immensely from this package. Roads, hospitals, education. We will build all of that. Traoré interrupted him sharply. But not at the cost of our independence. He walked to the edge of the table and looked the man in the eye. You wrote your terms in English, in legalese, in ink, thinking we wouldn't understand. Thinking we'd be too tired, too poor, too desperate to read the fine print. He leaned in slightly. But we read it, and we understand it, and we reject it. Every line of it. Silence. One of his ministers finally broke the stillness. Captain, what now? Traoré turned to the group. We walk away. Gasps, murmurs, a shifting tide moving through the room. The IMF rep stood. You're making a mistake, he warned. You'll lose investor confidence. We're not for sale, Traoré replied calmly. He pushed the contract across the table, not toward them, but away from him. The IMF team began packing their briefcases. Quietly, quickly. As they turned to leave, Traoré added one final word. Next time you write a contract for Africa, he said, his tone unshaken, assume we'll read it. The door shut behind them. In that silence, a new kind of contract was already forming. Not in ink, but in conviction. The podium was simple, no flags, no special lighting, no background music, just Traoré standing before a single microphone. Behind him, the national seal of Burkina Faso. The room was filled with journalists, local and international. Some skeptical, some hopeful. Cameras clicked. He didn't speak right away. He waited. Until every lens focused, until every journalist quieted, until the weight of the moment settled fully. Then he said, we refused the loan. A pause, a stir of whispers. He raised a hand, steadying the room. I know what they'll say, that we turned down progress, that we rejected development, that we don't understand economics. He glanced toward the front row, where several international reporters leaned forward. But they're wrong. We understand perfectly. He paused, then added slowly, we understand the smell of chains, even when it comes dressed in paper and ink. He opened the folder in front of him and pulled out the IMF contract. They no longer use soldiers to take our land, he said. They use paper, and on that paper is ink that smells like chains. The room fell still. Colonialism didn't end, he continued. It just changed uniforms. It traded bayonets for briefcases. It learned to speak our language, quote our GDP, and smile during photo ops. But make no mistake, he warned. The mission stayed the same. To take what is ours and call it a favor. He held up a page. This clause here, it says, if we default, they seize our mines. This one, they take control of our roads. And here, our schools, our water, our ability to govern without permission. He looked directly into the cameras now. Tell me, how is that different from occupation? His words echoed. He didn't blink. They offer us billions, he said, but tied to silence. They say it's aid, but it comes with strings long enough to choke us. They build schools, yes, but only after we privatize education. They build hospitals, but only if we surrender the rights to the minerals beneath our soil. He lowered the papers and let them fall gently onto the podium. My people, he said, softening, this was not just a contract. It was a test. They thought we would sign because we are poor, because we are tired, because they think we are desperate. He shook his head. But we are not desperate. We are awake. And we are done trading our dignity for false promises. There was a growing energy in the room now. Not applause. Not yet. But something stirring. A hum of understanding. This country, he said, was built by hands that knew pain and hunger, but also courage. My grandfather didn't learn to read, but he knew when someone was lying to him. My mother carried water on her back so I could go to school, and now they want to sell her water back to her? His voice tightened. No, we've learned. We've read the terms. And we will not sell our soul, even if it's disguised as a loan. He stepped back from the podium. But then he paused, as if remembering something important. And to the other African nations listening, he said, raising his voice just slightly, read every word. Page 89, page 72, page 81. Do not let them turn your future into collateral. He didn't stay for questions. He didn't wait for headlines. He folded the contract in half, placed it in a brown envelope, and handed it to an aide. Put it in the National Museum, he said quietly. Then he walked out of the room. No handshake, no compromise. Just a man who saw the chains hidden in ink and refused to wear them. The conference room inside the Ministry of Justice wasn't used to this kind of tension. It wasn't war, but it felt like one. At the center of the long oak table lay the IMF contract, printed in full, every single clause. Around it sat a dozen of Burkina Faso's sharpest legal minds, constitutional lawyers, economists, international trade specialists. Some had studied at Sorbonne, others in Moscow. But all of them, today, worked under one roof, focused on one shared mission. Traoré didn't attend this session. He didn't need to. His instructions had been clear and firm. Don't skim it. Don't summarize it. Dissect it, word by word. They began with the opening clauses, welcoming language, aspirational terms. Phrases like mutual growth and shared responsibility littered the introduction like decorations at a festival. One lawyer muttered under her breath, "This part is written to make you let your guard down." Then came the real work. Page 27. One economist highlighted a section on currency alignment. They want us to link our monetary policy to external recommendations, he said. This isn't about development, it's about dependency. Page 44. A lawyer pointed to a clause allowing external technical advisors to be embedded in key ministries. This means, she said, they can place foreign staff inside our economic planning offices without even calling it oversight. Page 53. Tax structure adjustment. They call it reform, another lawyer noted, but what they want is lower taxes on multinationals. They take the gold, someone added grimly, and we lose the revenue. The room grew quieter. When they reached page 72, no one spoke for a long moment. One line read, "Municipal services, including water, power and waste management, shall undergo strategic restructuring for increased efficiency." Increased efficiency? One woman scoffed. That's code for privatization. They'll sell our water systems to outside firms, another added, raise prices, cut access, and call it modern governance. A younger analyst flipped ahead to page 81. "Education support sounds generous, right?" she said, then read aloud, "Preferential funding to be made available to competitive private education initiatives demonstrating international scalability." A senior lawyer tapped her pen against the table. "That means," she said slowly, "they'll defund our public schools and hand contracts to foreign-owned companies, who then charge tuition to families already living on the edge." One man leaned back, tone dry. "It's colonialism," he said, "just with better fonts." Then came the clause they all knew was coming. Page 89. Everyone leaned in. The language was sterile, but the meaning, violent. In the event of financial distress, creditor shall be granted temporary administrative access to specified national assets as detailed in Annex 4. Annex 4 listed gold mines, lithium zones, highway corridors, telecommunication hubs, and more. One expert closed the file slowly and shook his head. "This," he said firmly, "isn't aid. This is acquisition, hidden behind the language of help." Another whispered, "They've redesigned the chains, no steel, just contracts." The youngest in the room, an intern barely out of law school, asked softly, "How many countries sign documents like this?" The silence that followed was louder than any answer could have been. One advisor finally spoke. "Dozens, maybe more." And most never realized what they gave up, until it was far too late. The room felt like a courtroom now, but there were no witnesses, just evidence and realization. "This explains why they rushed the timeline," said a trade expert. They expected us to be too desperate to read carefully, to overlook the footnotes. But Traoré didn't, another added. No, said the senior lawyer, without hesitation. He read what no one was supposed to read. They began documenting every clause, highlighting every red flag, cross-referencing with case studies from across Africa and South Asia. Patterns emerged, identical phrases in different nations. Copy-paste colonization. By the time the sun dipped low outside the Justice Ministry, the table was covered in annotated printouts, paragraphs filled with arrows and circles, margins lined with warnings and scribbled alerts. This wasn't a one-time deception, the lead counsel said. This is a system, a template. One minister entered the room late, having just come from a televised briefing. What should I tell the media? She asked. The lead lawyer looked up without hesitation. Tell them the truth. Tell them we found the same chains our ancestors once fought to break, only now they use legal terms instead of whips. She nodded once, turning to leave. But before she reached the door, the youngest analyst stopped her. Tell them something else too, he said. She turned. Tell them we caught it in time. The room was packed tighter than ever. Journalists filled every seat. Some stood against the walls. Others balanced cameras on shoulders, sweat gathering on foreheads under the glare of lights. International media crews jostled for position. CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC RT, and dozens of African outlets. Something bigger than usual was unfolding, and the world knew it. At exactly noon, Traoré entered. No suit, no ceremonial sash, just his olive green fatigues and red beret. The uniform of a soldier who never forgot why he stepped into politics. As he moved toward the podium, a senior IMF aide stepped from the shadows near the exit and leaned in. We can make this go away, the man whispered. Traoré paused. So can I, he replied, without turning. Then he stepped up to the microphone. No notes, he said. No teleprompter, just truth. I know many of you came expecting a routine update, he began, his voice calm, steady. But I called this press conference to speak about something far more urgent than policy. I am here to expose an attack. Not with weapons, but with paper. Not with war, but with words. Flashbulbs erupted. He raised the IMF contract into the air. This, he said, was offered to Burkina Faso as aid. $200 billion in loans. Sounds generous, doesn't it? Roads, schools, water. But what they didn't want you to see, what they buried on the pages 72, 81, and 89, is the price, the real price. He opened the document and read aloud. In the event of financial distress, creditor shall retain immediate access to national assets. He looked up. Do you hear that? Not support, not restructure. Access, control, ownership. Murmurs rippled across the room. He turned another page. Privatization of municipal water services shall be explored. His tone sharpened. That means our rivers, our wells, our life source, sold. Another page. Educational sector reform to prioritize competitive private institutions. He slammed the folder shut. That means turning our children's futures into profit margins for foreign firms. He stepped back, taking a breath. His eyes scanned the faces before him. This isn't new, he said. It's the old playbook. Only the cover has changed. They once came with guns, now they come with graphs. They used to take land, now they take laws. And they call it development. One journalist raised her hand. President Traoré, the IMF denies these clauses are predatory. They say this is standard global policy. He answered without hesitation. Standard for who? He said sharply. For the nations already crushed under similar contracts. For the ports auctioned off in Ghana. For the hospitals privatized in Zambia. For the schools closed in Liberia. Another reporter, this time from a European outlet, stood. Are you accusing the IMF of economic sabotage? He looked the man in the eye. I'm not accusing anyone, he said. I'm exposing them. This is not sabotage, he continued. It's strategy. Cold, calculated. They bet we wouldn't read. They bet we were too poor, too weak, too desperate to say no. But we did read, and we are not. The room fell into silence. He leaned closer to the microphone. "Let the world hear this," he said. "Africa no longer accepts poisoned gifts dressed up as aid." A few claps broke out, then more. The room erupted, not in polite applause, but in thunderous affirmation. He raised a hand, calming the crowd. "I'm not here to create enemies," he said. "I'm here to protect sovereignty. If anyone offers us true partnership, mutual respect, and fairness, we will welcome it. But no more contracts written in invisible ink. No more help that ends in handcuffs." He lifted the envelope containing the marked-up contract. "This," he said, "will not be filed away in a drawer somewhere. This will be published, made public, taught in schools, studied in law classes. Because our children, our future leaders, must know what we almost signed away." He turned, stepping down from the podium. As he passed the IMF aide still standing at the edge of the stage, he handed him the envelope. "Tell your board," he said, "we don't need silence. We need justice." Then he walked straight through the media crowd and into the hallway, not stopping once, leaving behind a press corps stunned into silence. And a world that suddenly realized Burkina Faso was not afraid to say no. The air in the presidential council chamber was dense, not from heat, but from pressure. Once again, the IMF team had returned, this time more carefully dressed, more softly spoken, more deliberate in tone. They were accompanied by representatives from the African Development Bank, a World Bank observer, and 2 ambassadors, quietly observing from the far corner. They brought fresh documents, tweaked language, and a public relations smile stretched just wide enough to seem sincere. The table was set. Water glasses gleamed under overhead lights. Folders lined the center, each one printed with flags. Burkina Faso's on the left, IMF's on the right. The symbolism was deliberate and cold. Traoré entered without announcement. No security detail, no chief of staff, just him. He walked to the head of the table, but didn't sit. His eyes scanned the flags, then settled squarely on the IMF insignia, stitched into the cloth runner down the center. "I appreciate your punctuality," he said. The IMF lead negotiator nodded, offering a carefully rehearsed smile. "We believe, Mr. President, that we can still find common ground. We've reviewed your concerns. Several provisions have been softened, language clarified. We hope—" Traoré raised his hand. "No need to explain," he said, voice level. He reached for the center of the table and gripped the IMF flag. Then, without drama, without words, he folded it neatly. Once, twice, and set it aside. The room froze. He turned and took a small rolled cloth from his pocket. With care, he unwrapped it and revealed a neatly folded Burkinabe flag. He placed it squarely in the center of the table. Silence. "If we talk again," he said, voice low but cutting through every ear in the room, "it will be nation to nation, not master to servant." The IMF rep stiffened. "President Traoré, with respect." "You don't give me respect," Traoré replied. "You give me terms. You give me pressure. You give me deadlines disguised as diplomacy. We are offering assistance. You are offering ownership." He tapped the table. "Under your contracts, our land becomes yours. Our water, yours. Our sovereignty, managed through quarterly reviews." An ambassador tried to interject. "Captain Traoré, surely this is a symbolic gesture?" He turned to her. "Yes, it is," he said simply. He nodded toward the flag. "And symbols matter. For decades, the world saw Africa as a blank space to be negotiated over. You hung your flags, drew your maps, wrote our futures without us." He turned to a young construction supervisor standing nearby. "This man hasn't been paid by an international donor," he said softly. "He's paid by this nation's own budget. From revenue we refuse to give away." He faced the camera again. "They call us reckless. They say we should have accepted the loan, but none of them ask about page 89, about the schools they wanted to sell, the water they planned to meter, or the clauses they wrote hoping we'd never read them." He held up a printed page from one of the editorials. "Let me be clear. I am not anti-West. I am anti-blindfold. If your offer comes wrapped in hidden chains, I will always say no." If your partnership begins with threats, I will never call it friendship. The press didn't know how to respond. They were expecting damage control, maybe even an apology, but what they got was resistance. A steady, unwavering resistance. Inside international offices, the pushback began immediately. A major donor foundation announced a pause on a regional youth employment initiative in Burkina Faso. A senior European diplomat issued a vague statement about concerns regarding transparency and governance. Back at the IMF headquarters, a private memo circulated marked confidential. It didn't suggest military intervention or open sanctions. It simply stated, accelerate narrative strategy, reframe Traoré as uncooperative. The Whisper campaign had become a quiet operation. Traoré responded not with rebuttals, but with results. He fast-tracked a public audit of all government accounts and broadcast the entire process openly. He opened budget meetings to citizen observers. He stood before university students and answered questions live, uncensored. The more they whispered, the louder he became. He gave interviews to African media first, then Latin American outlets, then Pan-Asian stations. He told the same story, in every language. We said no to the loan, not because we are proud, but because we have finally learned to read what others hoped we'd ignore. A veteran journalist asked him on air, "Do you fear what comes next?" Traoré smiled and replied, "I fear forgetting who we are, not the consequences of remembering." The screen faded to black, but the message didn't. It echoed in classrooms, in markets, in villages where people had never, until now, heard the word IMF. Those people knew exactly what it meant to lose something, without knowing they had signed it away. If you believe in Traoré's fight for dignity, share your thoughts below and comment "Africa knew" to show faith in Africa's future. The lights were dimmed in Traoré's private office. A single projector hummed, casting harsh light on a blank wall. Ministers sat in silence as images flickered across the surface. Shaky footage, satellite photos, grainy interviews. No narration, just a slow march of painful facts, a collapsed school roof in Zambia. The sign still read Hope Elementary, though its windows were boarded and desks stacked like firewood. A voice crackled from the speakers. It was shut down after the government redirected funds to meet debt payments. They called it restructuring. Next, a shot of a copper mine in northern Zambia. Once national, now operated by a foreign conglomerate. A young miner, face coated in dust, spoke into the lens. "They told us it would bring jobs. Now they export everything. We can barely afford to eat." The images shifted again. Ghana, a port terminal, giant cranes moving containers marked with logos of foreign banks. The port manager, off camera, muttered, "We had to lease it for 30 years to cover interest. The land is ours, but the profits aren't." Then a map appeared. Dots scattered across the continent. Ports, roads, mines, water systems, all turned over. All collateral. Burundi's state-owned power utility, privatized. Malawi's grain reserves, liquidated after default. Mozambique's fishing waters, licensed out under repayment clauses no one remembered agreeing to. Traoré didn't speak. The video continued. A hospital in Liberia, empty beds, broken ventilators, a nurse standing outside, looking on. "We were promised upgrades," he said, voice calm yet firm. But the loan demanded budget cuts. "So now," he continued, eyes scanning the room, "we send critical patients to private clinics. If they can't pay, they die." A voice spoke from the back. Minister Saidu leaned forward, arms folded tightly. "We were warned," he said quietly, "but we didn't have a trial." Heads nodded slowly across the room. Another minister whispered, "We were told those nations lacked discipline, that we would manage the terms better." The video paused on a shot of children in Sierra Leone, sitting on the floor, scribbling in broken notebooks. Their school's roof was half tarp, half sky. The screen went black. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then Traoré turned in his chair, eyes sharp. "I didn't show you this to shame those countries," he said quietly but firmly. "I showed it so we never become one of them." He stood, Each of those nations signed documents that looked exactly like ours. They too believed the promises: roads, security, growth. And they were told these clauses were standard, their terms generous. He picked up the IMF contract from his desk and held it up for all to see. "This isn't just a loan," he said, "it's a pattern, designed to repeat itself until the entire continent forgets what it means to own what it builds." He turned to his Minister of Foreign Affairs. "I want envoys sent to every nation that has entered these agreements, quietly, respectfully. We're not there to interfere. We're there to learn, to document, to listen." "Yes, Captain," she replied, "and I want a national report published. Every citizen must understand what nearly happened here. Not as fear, but as awareness." He looked out the window. Beyond the compound walls, children walked home from school, women carried vegetables on their heads, soldiers stood guard in quiet watch. "They've trusted us," he said softly. "We cannot return their trust with silence." Later that night, he met with a delegation of young economists and law students. He spread out copies of the loan agreements across the table. "Study these, learn the language they use, understand how power hides in punctuation, then teach others." One student asked, "If they keep offering the same poison, what's the alternative?" Trio replied firmly, "We learn to grow our own food, mine our own gold, build our own schools. We make mistakes, but those mistakes will be ours, and we'll fix them without selling the ground beneath us." Another student asked, "Do you think the world will let us?" He looked at her carefully, then said, "They don't have to let us. We just have to stop asking." The email came quietly, an encrypted file sent through an anonymous channel flagged by a cyber analyst in the Ministry of Digital Security. At first, it looked like spam, but the sender address matched an internal IMF domain. The subject line read, "Internal Memo, Strategic Rationale, Burkina Faso Package." Traoré was called to the operations room immediately. He entered, still in uniform. His eyes locked on the laptop at the center of the table. An aide cleared his throat. "Sir, you'll want to read this yourself." Traoré sat down. The file was already open. His eyes scanned the lines. Quickly. Faster than most people could read aloud. "We anticipate low resistance due to domestic need for infrastructure. Priority should be given to lithium corridor control. The deposits alone justify the loan." He stopped. Scrolled down further. "Gold extraction rights can be negotiated in Phase 2, ideally once debt leverage matures. Communications must maintain a development tone to avoid triggering sovereignty sensitivities." He didn't blink. "Public perception must focus on employment and modernization. Internally securing mineral logistics, that is the core strategic gain." He slammed the laptop shut. The echo cracked through the room like a gunshot. "So it was never about our people," he said. No one answered. He stood and looked around the table. "They never cared about our roads, our schools, our hospitals. They wanted the earth beneath our feet." The aide closest to him spoke cautiously. "Should we verify the authenticity?" he asked. "It doesn't matter," Traoré replied. "Even if it's a forgery, it's the truth." Moments later, the Minister of Mines entered the room. He'd just returned from a field assessment near Dori, carrying maps and updated surveys of a newly confirmed lithium belt stretching across the Sahel. "We have enough lithium to supply half the continent's energy storage needs," he reported, "and enough gold to triple our reserves." He set the papers down and paused. "They know. That's why they rushed the loan. That's why they buried page 89. Traoré stared at the maps. He saw not just minerals, he saw leverage, destiny, history repeating itself with a smile and a signature. "They don't offer aid to the hungry," he muttered. "They offer contracts when the ground is rich." A communications officer entered with a printed dossier. "There's more," she said. "We traced recent articles accusing you of instability. Most were seeded by think tanks funded by resource extraction firms. Some have direct financial ties to infrastructure groups bidding on lithium transport." Traoré nodded slowly. The puzzle was no longer a mystery. He turned to the room. "We've been played before, but not this time." He ordered an immediate freeze on all foreign resource contracts, pending a full transparency review. He established a national task force, geologists, economists, military intelligence. Their job: audit every site, every handshake, every agreement made in the last 20 years. That night on state television, Traoré addressed the nation again. "I've seen the truth behind their generosity," he said. "They smiled while marking our soil, called us partners, while planning to extract what is ours." He lifted the email printout for the cameras. They wrote, "The lithium deposits alone justify the loan." That is what they really wanted. Not to help, but to own. He paused. "But we will not be owned." The next day, international markets reacted. Mining stocks tied to Burkina Faso dipped. A spokesperson for a European energy company called Traoré's actions unfortunate. An IMF official claimed the email was taken out of context. But the damage was done. The illusion was gone. For the first time in decades, a leader had not only refused the offer, but exposed the motive behind it. Traoré called his ministers one by one. "This isn't about a loan anymore," he told them. "This is about the future of every child born on our soil. We either sell them or we stand for them." They stood. The international headlines were still circling. But inside Burkina Faso, something far more important was unfolding. Traoré wasn't waiting for the next IMF threat. He was building something different. Quietly, strategically, on his own terms. No loans, no interest rates, no quarterly compliance reviews written in foreign offices. He picked up the phone, not to New York or Paris, but to Bamako and Niamey. 3 days later, he hosted a closed-door summit in a modest government building, not a luxury hotel. No translators were needed. The language was shared history, common wounds, and a hunger for something new. The presidents of Mali and Niger arrived with their teams, economists, engineers, and agricultural experts. There was no red carpet, just a long wooden table, a pot of coffee, and the full text of the IMF contract laid bare between them. Traoré opened the meeting. "We've all seen the old playbook. We've all worn the smiling noose. I propose we write a new model." The leaders exchanged glances, absorbing the weight of that statement. "What do you have in mind?" asked Mali's president. Traoré replied, "One that doesn't begin with debt, but with dignity. Not loans, not gifts, but shared investment, shared production, shared reward." Niger's finance minister leaned forward, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "Joint ventures?" he asked. Traoré nodded. "Yes, we each contribute what we have. Land, labor, minerals, infrastructure. No collateral, no interest, just contracts among equals." The proposal was simple, bold, and radical. Each nation would hold equal stakes in shared development zones, across borders, in clean energy, mining, transport, and food security. All profits would return to the people via transparent national accounts. No offshore routing, no international arbitration without mutual consent. Then one voice raised a concern. "And if there's a shortfall?" Traoré answered firmly, "We adjust, together, not by selling each other off." Within 2 weeks, the framework was signed. The Sahel Development Accord was born, not under the approval of any international bank, but through mutual trust built on shared scars. Traoré didn't stop there. He opened new dialogues with China and Russia, but with firm conditions. No extractive contracts, no exclusive mining licenses, no unbalanced supply chains, only equity participation, with full technology transfer clauses and national oversight. Moscow responded first. A team of engineers from Russia's energy sector arrived quietly. They visited solar fields in the north, lithium deposits in the east, and the unfinished hydroelectric site along the Black Volta. A joint press statement followed. Russia will enter equity partnerships with Burkina Faso in energy infrastructure and resource processing. Full ownership remains sovereign. Technical assistance, training, and revenue sharing will be negotiated annually under mutual review. No debt. China followed cautiously. They offered to build a processing plant for agricultural exports in exchange for a 15% stake. Traoré replied with a counteroffer, 10% stake, no raw export, local labor requirements, and joint management. Beijing accepted. One journalist asked during a public briefing, "Aren't you just switching empires?" Traoré smiled. "Not empires, just terms. And this time, the ink comes from our pen." During a televised ceremony, Traoré stood before the first equity contract, signed with Mali and Niger. He held it up, then stamped it with the national seal. We share the harvest, not the chain. The room erupted in applause. Not from diplomats, but from farmers, students, and workers invited to witness the moment. This was not policy, it was proof. Partnership didn't have to begin with fear. Africa could negotiate not from weakness, but from value. Later that evening, Traoré sat with his economic team around a simple dinner table. No ceremony, just bread, rice, and tea. This model will be slower, one advisor warned. But it's ours, another added firmly. Traoré nodded in quiet agreement. And if we fail, we'll fail free. He poured tea into chipped cups, smiled softly, and gently raised his glass. To what's ours, to what stays ours. The pile of documents on Traoré's desk was growing thicker by the hour. Reports from new partnerships, security updates, procurement lists. But tucked between policy memos and legal drafts was a small envelope. Folded unevenly, addressed in handwriting that was careful but uncertain. No official stamp, no courier signature, just one line on the back in pencil, reading, "From Miam, age 9, village of Yalgo." Traoré paused. He put down his pen, opened the letter slowly, and began to read. "Dear Captain, I don't know if I'm allowed to write to a president, but my teacher said I should try. I heard you said no to the men who wanted to take our land. Mama said you could have taken the money, but you didn't. And Papa said that means he can keep his job at the mine and we don't have to leave. Thank you for saying no." He paused for a moment, then continued. "My brother was scared we would have to move again. We already moved twice, but now Mama says we can stay. She cried when she said it, but not the sad kind, the happy kind. I think she's proud of you. I am too. You don't know me, but I know you, and I think you're brave." Traoré read the last line twice. He folded the letter carefully, as if it might tear under pressure, and placed it beside the national seal. He sat back in his chair and looked out the window. Outside, the capital moved as always. Cars honked, vendors shouted. But something in that letter cut through the noise more sharply than anything else that day. He called for his chief of staff. "Find her," he said. "Sir, the girl from Yalgo, Mariam. Find her and her family." By the end of the week, a simple ceremony was held at a school in the northern province. No media, no press release. Just Traoré standing at the chalkboard of a sunlit classroom, surrounded by children in faded uniforms and worn sandals. He pulled the letter from his pocket and read it aloud. When he finished, the room was utterly quiet. Then Mariam, sitting in the second row, raised her hand, shy but steady. "Captain, are you really the one who stopped them from taking the mine?" Traoré smiled gently. "Yes, but not alone." She tilted her head. "Who helped you?" He looked around at the children. "All of you. Every child who deserves to stay where they were born. Every mother who deserves clean water. Every father who should not lose his job because someone signed away the land beneath him." He turned to the teacher. "She reminded me why we fight, not with guns, but with decisions." Later that afternoon, the entire village gathered in the schoolyard. Elders stood beneath baobab trees. Workers in dust-covered overalls lined the fence. Traoré didn't stand on a platform. He stood beside Mariam's father, a man who had spent 10 years working at the mine and nearly lost it all to a line buried on page 89. "I could have taken the money," Traoré said quietly, "and most would have understood. But Mariam reminded me that understanding isn't the same as believing. She believed I would protect what's ours, and belief is heavier than gold." He handed the family a simple certificate, printed, bearing the national seal, and 3 bold words. "This land stays ours." The crowd clapped, not for a president, but for a promise. Back in the capital, ministers asked why he had made the trip without an escort, without a camera crew. Traoré placed Mariam's letter on the center of the cabinet table. "Because they've read enough headlines," he said. "It's time they read the heart of the country." The wooden doors closed softly behind the last minister entering. No press, no aides, no cameras, just the president and his cabinet gathered in the old war room where decisions during the transitional years were once whispered by candlelight. The air was still. Traoré stood at the head of the long table. A stack of foreign policy reports lay untouched beside him. The IMF contract remained sealed in a brown folder on his left. Mariam's letter rested folded carefully on his right. He didn't sit. "We've come far," he began, voice steady. "Farther than most believed we could." The ministers watched him. Some nodded, others remained silent, expectant. "We said no to their terms, and now the world is watching. Some hope we fail, others try to make sure we do." He paused, surveying the room. "Today's meeting is not for speeches," he said quietly. "It's for one question." He waited, letting the silence stretch. "Shall we stand alone?" No one moved. No IMF loan, no lifeline from old masters, no promises wrapped in penalties. He stepped away from the table. "We will walk a harder road, but it will be ours." So he asked again, "Shall we stand alone?" The silence held for a beat. Then Minister Sadu, who had once doubted the refusal, pushed back his chair and stood. No words, just the creak of wood beneath the weight. Next came the Minister of Education, then the Minister of Health, the Minister of Agriculture, one after the other. No applause, no declarations, just the sound of chairs moving and men and women rising. Even those who had hesitated, the ones who once believed the loan might bring relief, stood now not in surrender, but in firm conviction. Traoré didn't smile. He simply looked across the room, absorbing the gravity of that moment. "This is not unity in comfort," he said softly. "This is unity in defiance." He walked slowly around the table, meeting each person's gaze as he passed. "They'll say we're naive, that we don't understand global finance, that pride has clouded our policy," he continued firmly. "But they don't see what we see." He paused and pointed toward the window behind them. "They don't see the girl in Yalgo. They don't see the farmer in Fada. They don't see the nurse in Bobo, unpaid by foreign grants, yet still showing up. They don't see what we are standing on." He tapped the floor lightly. "Our own ground. For once, we're not standing on borrowed promises." He moved back to the front of the room, voice steady. "You've all been asked to bend, not by me, but by fear. And still, you stood. That's enough." Then he picked up the brown IMF folder and walked to the fireplace behind him. He didn't tear it, he didn't burn it. Instead, he placed it gently, unopened, inside the hearth. "Let it rest," he said quietly. "Its silence is more honest than its words." He turned back to the room, gaze steady. "From this moment forward, no decision will be made that risks our land, our water, or our independence. We write our own terms. We negotiate from value, not desperation." The ministers remained standing. No one spoke. No need. It was the loudest silence in the history of their government. Traoré turned toward the door. Before leaving, he looked back one last time. "When history writes of this day," he said, "they won't record speeches. Just this." He nodded at the room, a room full of men and women who stood. Then he walked out. They came without warning. 2 black SUVs arrived at the presidential compound just after sunrise, slicing through the calm of early morning with tinted windows and diplomatic plates. Inside, 3 senior IMF officials waited quietly. No media, no press kits. Just a locked briefcase and practiced expressions that hinted at persuasion. By the time Traoré was informed, they were already in the outer conference room. He didn't rush. He entered at his own pace, alone, dressed in his uniform with his beret tucked under his arm. When he stepped in, the IMF delegation stood, offering polite smiles. One stepped forward and placed the sleek black briefcase gently onto the table, as if it contained fragile peace. Traoré didn't sit. "This is the amended version," the lead representative said briefly. "Our board has reviewed your feedback. You'll find many clauses revised or removed altogether. There's flexibility now, sovereign protections, local control language." He tapped the case lightly. "We think this reflects a better understanding of your position and your people's hopes." Traoré looked at the briefcase, then slowly sat across from them. He did not touch the briefcase. He did not ask for the documents inside. Instead, he folded his hands calmly and waited. After a long pause, the representative cleared his throat. "Captain Traoré, we believe you'll find this offer far more equitable." Traoré's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did you remove the clause about debt-triggered mineral access?" The man replied cautiously, "We adjusted it to require bilateral review prior to any—" "Did you remove it?" Traoré pressed. The man hesitated. No, but we softened it. Traoré raised one hand gently to interrupt. The man stopped speaking. Traoré leaned forward, voice firm. There is no version of this contract that ends differently. Whether it's on page 89 or page 200, the result is the same. The delegate opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré continued. You see Burkina Faso as a risk to be managed. I see it as a legacy to be protected. He stood. The people of this country already chose when they stayed on their farms, sent me letters, stood in silent solidarity with their ministers. That was not a rejection of progress. It was a demand for ownership. He walked to the table and gently pushed the briefcase back across the polished wood. We're not signing history's mistake again. The room fell silent. An aide began to speak, but was cut off by the lead representative, who said quietly, I understand. Just know this may close doors in the markets. With donors, with investors. Traoré nodded, then let them close. He stepped toward the door, but paused. Because when we finally build this nation with our own hands, it won't be because someone opened a door for us. It will be because we built the house brick by brick. The IMF team rose, briefcase in hand, and left in silence, footsteps retreating like shadows through the hallway. No threats, no handshakes, just quiet exit. Hours later, Traoré met with his Youth Advisory Council, a group of students, young farmers, and newly trained engineers. He recounted the meeting. One student, a girl not much older than Mariam, raised her hand. Captain, what happens now that they've gone? Traoré smiled softly. We grow slower, harder, but together. She nodded. With no one above us, only the sky, he added. The exhibit opened on a Tuesday morning. No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, no political speech. Just the quiet footsteps of students entering the National Museum of Burkina Faso, each notebook in hand, eyes wide, guided by teachers who deeply understood the weight of what they were about to see. It wasn't gold or statues or war relics that pulled them in, but a single sheet of paper framed in glass and mounted on a plain beige wall. At the top of the frame, page 89, the page we did not sign. The tour guide, a soft-spoken woman in her early 40s, stood before the display. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. This page, she said quietly, pointing, was part of a contract that would have given away our mines, our roads, our water, not through war, not by force, but with quiet ink. The children leaned in closer. She read the clause aloud slowly. In the event of debt distress, creditor shall retain immediate access to national assets, including mineral reserves, infrastructure zones, and strategic utilities. A boy near the front raised his hand. Did they really want to take everything? The guide nodded, not all at once, but piece by piece. That's how nations disappear without anyone noticing. It doesn't take tanks, just a signature. Another student softly asked, who stopped it? The guide smiled gently. Our president read what they thought he never would, and when he saw what they buried on this page, he said, no. She tapped the glass lightly. This page never became law. That's why your father still works at the lithium plant. That's why your older sister is studying mining engineering. That's why the gold under our feet is still ours. In the next room, visitors viewed photos from the summit with Mali and Niger. There were models of solar grids, maps of joint infrastructure corridors, and timelines of the Sahel Accord. Each piece of the exhibit told the story not of what was lost, but what had been defended. At the center of the museum, beneath a dome of filtered light, stood a replica of the national seal. Surrounding it, a circular panel titled, We Didn't Sign Because We Understood. Inside the presidential office, Traoré received the first photos from the museum team. They'd kept their promise. The original IMF contract remained sealed, untouched, displayed in its entirety. But it was page 89 that drew all the attention. He studied the images silently. A staff member entered carrying a letter from the museum's guestbook. It had been written in the careful cursive of a teenage girl. My father once said, history is something we survive, but now I see it's something we can shape. Thank you for reading the fine print. Traoré placed the letter beside Mariam's. Later that evening, he visited the museum alone. No escort, no announcement. He walked past the exhibit, slowly pausing only when he reached the page. He stood before the glass and read the clause one more time. Not because he didn't remember, but because some truths are worth rereading. A janitor walked by, recognized him, and stopped. "Captain," he said, unsure if he should speak. Traoré turned and nodded. The man pointed to the display. "That page, it's heavier than it looks." Traoré looked back at it. "It always was." The janitor hesitated. "Why put it in a museum?" Traoré replied softly, "Because what we don't show gets repeated." The man nodded and walked on, pushing his cart down the polished hallway. Traoré remained for a few more minutes, watching as a group of students entered, whispering to one another, eyes wide with curiosity. He stepped back, letting them take his place. They didn't know him by face, but they would know what he refused to sign. The sun rose over the dry plains of Kaya, casting long shadows across a brand new structure of white brick and blue-painted windows. There was no imported contractor, no foreign flag planted in the soil, just laughter echoing from wide courtyards and chalk dust floating from open classroom doors. This was the first public school built entirely from Burkina Faso's own mining revenue. No loans, no grants, no silent strings. The villagers had watched it rise day by day, not from promises made in cities they'd never visit, but from decisions made in a room where page 89 was never signed. That morning, Captain Traoré arrived quietly. There were no armored vehicles, just a single jeep, a plain convoy, and a man walking into a school with his sleeves rolled and boots still dusty from another village visit. As he entered, children in bright green uniforms looked up from their desks. One girl gasped and whispered, "It's him!" Then the chant began, not forced, not rehearsed, just raw. Traoré, Traoré. He held up a hand gently, and they stopped almost instantly. But one child in the front row stood and said something louder than all the chants combined. He said no so we could say yes. The teacher paused, eyes full, and nodded slowly. That was the truth no economist could grasp. Traoré walked through the halls, science labs, libraries, solar panels on the roof. He paused at a display wall lined with student projects. One poster read, "Burkina Faso doesn't borrow its future, it builds it." A young boy approached shyly, holding a model of a wind turbine made from sticks and bottle caps. "Do you like it?" the boy asked. Traoré knelt and smiled. "Did you build this with my brother? We want to be engineers." Traoré nodded. "Then build, and teach others to build." In the courtyard, parents gathered. Many were former miners, their faces aged by dust and sun, but softened by something else: certainty. Their labor hadn't vanished into foreign accounts. It had stayed, and now it stood. Bricks, windows, futures. The village elder stepped forward. "We were told we'd never afford a school without help, but the mine stayed ours. The gold stayed here, and so did hope." Traoré listened, then turned to the crowd. "This school was not a gift," he said. "It was a decision. We could have signed away the land beneath our feet, but we didn't. Because you can't teach children from buildings built on debt. You teach them from ground you own." He looked out at the horizon. "This is the model now. No middlemen, no delays. What we take from the earth goes back into the hands that dig it." That afternoon, the school bell rang. But instead of dismissing the children, it marked the beginning of something else. A new class began. One not found in textbooks. Students gathered beneath a tree where a young teacher wrote on a chalkboard, "Economic Independence 101." And the first sentence beneath it, page 89, stays unsigned. Inside the administrative building, the principal showed Traoré the school's financial report. Every coin tracked, every brick accounted for, nothing outsourced, nothing hidden. "It's not just about building schools," she said. "It's about building the habit of ownership." He nodded. She added, "And they know who made that possible. But we don't teach them to worship leaders." "No," Traoré replied softly, "just to remember choices." As he prepared to leave, the students lined the walkway. No flags, no speeches. Just voices repeating one simple phrase as he passed. He said no so we could say yes. And for the first time in a long time, Traoré didn't answer with words. He simply walked, head high, back straight, through a gate that now truly belonged to the people. The military academy was quiet that morning. The sun hadn't yet reached full height, and a soft breeze stirred the flags lining the courtyard. Inside the lecture hall, cadets sat straight in their uniforms, boots polished, eyes focused forward. But they weren't expecting a standard lesson today. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the front of the room. He wore no medals, no stage presence, just the green fatigues of a man who never stopped being a soldier, even as the world called him president. On the wall behind him was a single projection: leadership and legacy. He began not with speech, but with a story. There was a page 89, in a contract that promised us everything: development, prosperity, connection to the world. He paused. But it also promised something else: quiet surrender. If we had signed it, we would have owned nothing beneath our feet. Not our roads, not our minerals, not our future. The room remained still. A cadet raised his hand. Young, barely 20, but his voice was firm. "Captain, why did you read every page? Most presidents would have signed it, trusted advisors, delegated." Traoré smiled gently. "Because in the fine print, they hide the chains." He stepped away from the podium and walked between the rows of cadets. "Those chains don't rattle, they don't shine. They come dressed in legal terms and economic forecasts. They come with handshakes and business-class flights, but they weigh just as much as the ones our ancestors wore." He stopped beside the young cadet. "That's why I read every page, because if I hadn't, we wouldn't be standing on our land. We'd be renting it." He returned to the front of the room, and now we write our own contracts, with our own pen and our own future. The cadets stayed silent, not because they were ordered to, but because they were absorbing every word. He pointed to the screen. "You are the next generation of leaders. Not just in battle, in budgets, in negotiations, in decisions made far from the front lines, but with consequences that touch every village." He held up a small black folder, the original IMF contract, now marked with red ink stamps and notes. "This sits in our National Museum now, not because we glorify rejection, but because we celebrate recognition. We saw what was being done in our name, and we chose differently." He closed the folder. "Your duty will not always be to fight. Sometimes your duty will be to pause, to read, to question, and to say no when the whole world expects you to say yes." Another cadet stood. "Sir, if the pressure returns, if the world isolates us again, what do we hold on to?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "You hold on to the people. Not polls, not headlines, not foreign approval, just the people. They are the contract that matters." He looked across the room with steady resolve. Because leadership is not about being the smartest in the room. It's about being the last one willing to carry the weight of a choice. As the session ended, the cadets stood and saluted, not because of rank, but out of deep respect. Traoré nodded once, then walked out into the courtyard. Awaiting him was a young girl from the Kaya school, holding a simple folder. She approached softly, extending it to him with both hands. "I wrote every word myself," she whispered. He looked at her, opened the folder, and saw a handwritten report detailing new textbooks, the financial transparency system, and even sketches of proposed student workshops. He smiled. "So did I," he replied quietly. They stood there, 2 generations. One who had read every page to prevent loss, and one who now wrote new pages to ensure growth. The ink had changed. The story had changed. And this time, it belonged to them. He took a gentle breath and addressed the gathering of schoolchildren, teachers, parents, and villagers who had gathered quietly behind them. "This," he gestured toward Mariam's report and the children, "is what our choice created. This is the result of saying no so that you could say yes to your future." A hush fell, then broke into soft applause, not for a leader, but for a promise fulfilled. Later that day, back in his office, Traoré placed the cadet class photo next to Mariam's letter and the handwritten report. He gazed at the wall, where a framed placard read, "Page 89 stays unsigned." He paused, then whispered almost to himself, This is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of ours. And as evening light filtered through the window, he stepped outside to the silhouette of children playing in the school courtyard. He watched them for a long moment. Then, turning inward, with calm determination, Captain Ibrahim Traoré closed the door of his office softly behind him. In a world where silence is often cheaper than resistance, Captain Ibrahim Traoré chose the harder road, the one paved with truth, dignity, and unshakable love for his people. He didn't just read page 89, he rewrote the story that page could have ended. A soldier turned statesman, he showed us that real power lies not in how loud we speak, but in how deeply we listen, question, and act. What would you have done with that contract? Would your leaders have read every page? And more importantly, do you believe Africa can build without borrowing its future? If this story moved you, made you think, or made you hope, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Let Captain Traoré's no echo as your yes to a new kind of leadership, rooted in people, not promises. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.